Chapter 4. Marcus barely breathed as the Briton boy crept closer. The flickering fire painted the child's face in soft, shifting light. Young, curious, cautious. His wild hair was tangled with bits of twigs, his skin smudged with dirt and faint traces of war paint. His bare feet made almost no sound as he stepped lightly over the packed earth, careful not to wake the sleeping druid. A small rock rolled from his fingers, tapping against the cage bars. Marcus didn't move. The boy studied him intently, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, his clothes, his sandals. He squatted near the cage, head tilted, as though he had never seen anything like him before. Then, slowly, he reached into a small pouch at his waist and pulled out something. A tiny figure. It was woven from twigs and thin strips of bark, shaped crudely like a person. Arms outstretched, legs bound together, a simple loop of string tied around its middle. The craftsmanship was rough, but intricate in its own way. The boy held it out to Marcus. Marcus hesitated, then reached through the bars, his bound wrists making the motion awkward. The figure was light in his hands, the woven fibers rough against his fingertips. He turned it over, studying it. What did it mean? A gift? A warning? The boy watched with wide eyes, almost eager. Marcus parted his lips to speak. Clatter. Something tumbled from the boy's belt, a wooden ball bouncing against the dirt. The druid stirred. Her breath hitched, and in an instant, her head snapped up, her eyes darting toward them. The Briton boy tensed. For a single heartbeat, he locked eyes with Marcus, then bolted into the darkness, vanishing beyond the firelight. Marcus clenched the tiny figure in his fingers, his pulse still quick. The druid let out a long, irritated sigh and rubbed her temples, clearly unimpressed with the disturbance. She glanced toward where the boy had run off, muttered something under her breath, then waved the thought away with a flick of her wrist. Her attention turned to Marcus. She pushed herself up from the wooden chair, her long cloak shifting around her as she moved toward the fire. Gathering a bowl and a ladle, she scooped a thick, unappetizing slop from a bubbling pot. The scent was earthy, unfamiliar, tinged with something vaguely herbal. With a slow, deliberate motion, she crouched near the cage and slid the bowl through the gap. Then she lifted her hand and motioned toward her own mouth. Eat. Marcus hesitated. The druid studied him, then shifted her gaze toward his ankle. Without asking, she reached out and touched the bandage, pressing gently against the wrapped joint. Marcus flinched, but she didn't seem interested in hurting him, only checking. Satisfied, she sat back on her heels, waiting. Marcus looked at the bowl, looked at the woven figure in his hands, and for the first time since crossing the wall, he felt something stranger than fear. He felt like he was being watched over. But by whom? The village stank of death. Smoke curled from what was left of the thatched roofs, the embers of collapsed huts glowing like dying stars in the night. Blood pooled in the dirt, seeping between shattered pottery and broken weapons. The bodies of Briton warriors and villagers alike lay sprawled where they had fallen, some with blades still buried in their chests, others with faces frozen in expressions of terror. Centurion Aelius stood among the wreckage, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His armor was spattered with mud, his cloak heavy with damp. Around him, his men moved like wolves through a slaughtered den, kicking over debris, dragging corpses, searching. It had been a swift attack. The Britons had fought, but they were no match for trained legionaries. And yet, no sign of Marcus. Aelius's grip tightened. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the ruin. A soldier jogged toward him, helmet dented from battle, his sword still slick with blood. "Sir," the man halted, panting. "We searched every hut, every body. We tore the whole village apart." A beat of silence. The soldier swallowed, then added, "The boy's not here. This was a waste. He's gone." Aelius said nothing. The firelight flickered against the hard planes of his face, his expression unreadable. The soldier shifted, uneasy. "Sir?" Aelius exhaled sharply, the sound almost lost in the crackle of dying flames. He looked over the wreckage, his gaze sweeping over the fallen, the burning, the empty. Then finally, "We returned to camp." A murmur of agreement passed between the men. The soldiers mounted their horses, their torches flickering against the darkened treetops. Hooves churned the bloodied earth as they turned southward toward the wall, toward the empire. The last light of their fire disappeared into the night. Cold and alone, Marcus sat in the cage, knees drawn to his chest. The fire outside had burned low, casting little warmth against the night air. The embers barely glowed anymore, and the damp chill of the forest crept into his bones. The tiny woven figure still rested in his hands. He turned it over between his fingers, tracing the rough twigs, the tiny loop of string. What had the Briton boy meant by giving it to him? Was it just a toy? A token? A symbol? His ankle still throbbed beneath the bandage, but the pain had dulled. He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position against the rough wooden bars. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. Marcus stared into the embers, his breath curling in the cold air. For the first time, the thought crept into his mind, slow and insidious. What if they never come?